If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on the incredible power of resilience and love. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more inspiring stories like this one. The Arizona sky burned a deep amber as the sun dipped below the mountains, casting long shadows over the quiet town of Mesa. Owen Carter, a 35-year-old former search and rescue officer, stepped out of his truck, his boots crunching against the gravel outside the Whispering Pines animal shelter. 2 years had passed since he retired after a helicopter crash left him with a limp and scars he hid better than the emotional ones. Each step toward the shelter felt like dragging a boulder, the weight of loss and guilt pressing on his shoulders. Owen hadn't come alone. His sister, Lauren, a determined optimist, had convinced him to visit. "You need someone," she had insisted. "Something to pull you out of your head." She meant well, but Owen wasn't convinced. Yet here he was, walking into the shelter, the stale scent of disinfectant mixed with fur greeting him like an old, unwelcome acquaintance. The kennels were lined up like a parade of forgotten lives, each dog vying for attention in its own way. Some barked frantically, their paws scraping at the metal gates. Others sat silently, their eyes tracking his every move with quiet desperation. But none of them felt right. As he reached the end of the aisle, a young staff member approached him. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "there's a German Shepherd in the back you might want to meet." "He's different." Something in her voice made Owen pause. "A shepherd?" he asked, a flicker of interest breaking through his guarded demeanor. She nodded. "Came in a few weeks ago. He's had a rough time, but there's something about him. Follow me." Owen followed her down a dim corridor to a secluded pen. Inside, curled into the corner, was a German Shepherd. His fur was a patchwork of black and tan, marred by scars on his leg and a torn ear. He looked up at Owen, his eyes dark and tired, not with the alertness Owen remembered from shepherds he'd worked with, but with a heaviness that struck him like a punch to the gut. Owen's breath caught. "No way," he whispered, gripping the cold metal bars of the kennel. The dog didn't move. No wagging tail, no recognition, just a hollow gaze that mirrored Owen's own reflection. "It's him," he said, his voice breaking. "It's Rio." The name hung in the air like a weight. Rio had been Owen's partner during his search and rescue days, the dog who had saved countless lives, and, on more than one occasion, Owen's own. They had been a team, inseparable, until the crash had taken everything. Owen had been medevaced out, and Rio had been reassigned, or so he thought. The staff member looked at him, her face soft with understanding. He was found abandoned at a small shelter across the state. They said his owner couldn't handle him anymore. "He's got severe anxiety and trust issues now." Owen's chest tightened. Rio, the brave dog who had once led them through collapsed buildings and raging floods, was now a shadow of himself. "He doesn't even recognize me," Owen murmured, stepping back. But even as he spoke, a flicker of something crossed Rio's face, a brief glimmer of familiarity, like a long-buried memory resurfacing. Owen knelt, his voice low and trembling. "Rio, buddy, it's me. It's Owen." The dog's ears twitched. His gaze locked on Owen, hesitant but curious. Owen stayed perfectly still, letting Rio decide. After a long moment, Rio pushed himself to his feet, limping over to the front of the kennel. He sniffed the air, then Owen's hand. Finally, as if a switch had flipped, Rio leaned his scarred head against Owen's palm. Owen's throat tightened as he fought back tears. "There you are," he whispered. "I thought I lost you." The staff member smiled softly. "Looks like he remembers you after all." Owen spent the next hour with Rio, sitting quietly by his pen, letting him adjust. Memories of their shared missions flooded back, Rio navigating rubble to find a missing child, his bark cutting through the chaos to signal a life saved. Those memories were a lifeline now, a reminder of what they had been to each other. By the time the shelter closed for the evening, Owen had made up his mind. "He's coming home with me," he told the staff. "You're sure?" the young woman asked. "He'll need patience, time, and care." Owen nodded, determination in his eyes. "We'll heal together." That night, Rio curled up on an old blanket Owen spread out for him in the living room. As Owen sat nearby, watching the dog's chest rise and fall in peaceful sleep, he felt something he hadn't in years, a glimmer of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, Owen believed it was one worth taking. Together, they would find their way back to the strength they once had. Together, they would build a new life. The Arizona night was still as Owen Carter sat on his porch, the cool desert breeze whispering through the cacti and sagebrush that lined the edges of his property. Inside, Rio lay in the corner of the living room, his posture stiff, his amber eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. The dog's cautious demeanor mirrored Owen's own hesitance, both of them trying to navigate a new beginning after lives defined by challenges and scars. Rio hadn't eaten since arriving. The food bowl sat untouched, the plush new bed ignored. He had retreated to the corner, maintaining a safe distance from everything Owen had prepared for him. Watching him, Owen couldn't help but feel a pang of rejection, even though he understood. He had been in that corner himself, emotionally if not physically. "You're not the only one who feels out of place," Owen said quietly, setting his dinner plate on the table. His voice was steady but soft, a habit from years of working with animals in tense situations. "But this is home now, and I'm not going anywhere." Owen decided to give Rio space. He busied himself with household chores, occasionally glancing at the dog, who remained unmoving except for the slight flick of his ears at every new sound. After a while, Owen turned on the TV, the low murmur filling the silence of the house. He sank into the couch, allowing the exhaustion of the day to catch up with him. As the hours ticked by, the tension in the room seemed to ease. Rio stretched slightly, his body less rigid, though he still kept his eyes on Owen. Finally, Owen stood, yawned, and stretched. "Good night, Rio," he said, leaving the living room light dimmed as he headed to bed. He left the door open, hoping the gesture would be an invitation rather than an imposition. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that Owen stirred, awoken by the faint sound of padded steps on the wooden floor. He kept his breathing even, not wanting to startle Rio. Through the sliver of light from the hallway, he saw the dog pause just outside the bedroom door. Rio stood there, his ears perked, as if deliberating whether to trust the man who had brought him home. After a moment, he lay down, his head resting on his paws, just inside the threshold. Owen smiled in the dark. It wasn't much, just a few feet closer, but it felt monumental. It was the first step in rebuilding what they had lost. The following days fell into a tentative rhythm. Owen kept things quiet, avoiding sudden movements or loud noises. He spent time outside, fixing the old fence around his yard and planting a few flowers along the walkway. He made it a point to leave the back door open, giving Rio the choice to join him if he wanted. One afternoon, while Owen worked on the fence, he felt a presence behind him. Turning slowly, he saw Rio standing at the edge of the porch, his head tilted, watching. Owen didn't say a word, just went back to hammering in the loose planks. Minutes later, Rio stepped off the porch, his movements careful but deliberate. He wandered the yard, sniffing the grass, his tail low but not tucked. It was the first time Owen had seen him explore. "Good boy, Rio," Owen said softly, his voice carrying the warmth of encouragement. The bond between them began to rebuild piece by piece. Rio started eating his meals, though only when Owen sat nearby. He would watch TV from across the room, but inch closer each evening until he lay at Owen's feet. By the end of the week, he had claimed the dog bed in the living room. His body relaxed as he napped in the late afternoon sunlight. One night, as Owen sat on the porch staring at the stars, Rio walked up and sat beside him. He rested his head against Owen's knee, a gesture so simple yet profound that it brought a lump to Owen's throat. He placed a hand on the dog's head, running his fingers through his fur. "Welcome home, Rio," he whispered. In that moment, Owen realized this wasn't just about giving Rio a second chance. It was about both of them finding their way back to life, to trust, and to love. Together, they would heal. Together, they would move forward. And for the first time in years, Owen felt the faint stirrings of hope. The sun was setting over the Arizona horizon, casting long golden shadows across Owen Carter's yard. Rio sat on the porch, his posture stiff, his eyes scanning the open space. The once vibrant dog Owen remembered had been replaced by a cautious and uncertain companion, but Owen wasn't giving up. He understood the weight Rio carried because he bore the same scars, emotional and physical. "Good night, Rio," Owen said softly, leaving the back door open as he went to bed. It had become a nightly ritual, his quiet way of saying, "You're welcome here whenever you're ready." He hadn't expected much, but the sound of soft paw steps against the wooden floor woke him in the middle of the night. Owen cracked open an eye and saw Rio lying at the foot of the bed, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed. It was a small step, but it was enough. Owen smiled to himself in the dark. The following morning, Owen rose early to work on the yard, hoping the fresh air and routine would help Rio adjust. He chopped wood for the fireplace, the rhythmic sound of the axe echoing across the property. From the corner of his eye, he saw Rio sitting at a distance, watching him. Owen paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Want to help, boy?" he asked in a light, playful tone. Rio didn't move, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Later that day, during their walk around the property, Owen picked up a stick and tossed it a few feet ahead. He didn't expect Rio to react, but to his surprise, the German Shepherd took a tentative step toward the stick. He stopped short, looking back at Owen as if unsure what to do next. Owen crouched down, his voice gentle. "It's okay, Rio. Just take your time." Rio sniffed the stick before retreating slightly, but Owen could see the gears turning in his head. Day by day, the wall of mistrust began to crack. On Tuesday, Rio followed Owen to the garden and sat beside him as he planted flowers. On Wednesday, Owen noticed Rio wagging his tail just a little when Owen called him inside for dinner. By Thursday, Rio had started eating his meals while Owen was still in the room, a sign that trust was slowly building. The real breakthrough came Friday morning. Owen grabbed an old tennis ball and took Rio to the backyard. He held the ball up and smiled. "You remember this, don't you?" Rio tilted his head, his ears perking slightly. Owen tossed the ball a short distance. For a moment, Rio hesitated, but then he moved, trotting toward it. He sniffed the ball, picked it up in his mouth, and carried it back to Owen, dropping it at his feet. Owen's heart swelled. He crouched down, scratching behind Rio's ears. "Good boy, Rio. You're still in there, aren't you?" Rio's tail wagged a slow, deliberate motion, but a wag nonetheless. It was the first time in weeks Owen had seen a glimmer of the dog he used to know. That evening, Owen sat on the porch, Rio lying at his feet. The stars began to emerge, dotting the sky like tiny beacons of hope. Owen reached down, running his hand through Rio's fur. "We're getting there, buddy," he said softly. "One step at a time." Rio looked up at him, his amber eyes meeting Owen. For the first time, there was a spark, a flicker of recognition and trust. In that moment, Owen realized this wasn't just about rescuing Rio. It was about rescuing each other, about rediscovering the strength to move forward, no matter how heavy the past. The morning mist lingered over Owen Carter's yard, shrouding the trees and grass in a soft gray haze. It was quiet, the kind of silence Owen had grown accustomed to, but never truly embraced. Yet today, something felt different. Owen found Rio sitting by the window, his amber eyes fixed on the world outside. The German Shepherd's posture was calm but distant, as if his mind wandered through a landscape only he could see. "Thinking about the old days, huh?" Owen said softly, standing a few feet away. Rio didn't move, his ears twitching slightly at the sound of Owen's voice. There was no response, but Owen wasn't discouraged. Every small moment like this felt like progress, a thread tying them back together. After breakfast, Owen decided it was time to try something meaningful. He went to his closet and pulled out a weathered wooden box. Inside were pieces of his past, medals, photos, letters, and tucked beneath it all, a worn rubber ball. It had been Rio's favorite during their time in the field. Owen held it in his hands for a moment, feeling the weight of memories both joyous and painful. Taking the ball outside, Owen found Rio lying in the yard, his ears perked as Owen approached. Without saying a word, Owen dropped the ball onto the ground near him. The soft thud made Rio's head lift. He sniffed the air, his body stiffening as if the object stirred something deep within. For a moment, Rio hesitated, his gaze darting between Owen and the ball. "You remember this, don't you?" Owen asked, his voice calm and steady. Rio leaned forward, his nose brushing the ball. He sniffed it cautiously, then stepped back, his movements deliberate and careful. Owen didn't push. He simply watched, hoping the familiarity of the toy might unlock a piece of their shared past. That afternoon, something shifted. Rio followed Owen around the yard, his steps more confident. When Owen sat on the porch for lunch, Rio surprised him by sitting nearby, his eyes steady on Owen's movements. For the first time since their reunion, Rio accepted food directly from Owen's hand. The gesture was small, but it felt monumental. "That's my boy," Owen whispered, his heart swelling with hope. He reached out slowly, his hand hovering near Rio's head. This time, Rio didn't flinch. He allowed the gentle touch, leaning into Owen's palm for just a moment before pulling away. That evening, Owen retrieved a blanket from the couch and spread it on the porch. He sat down with Rio lying a few feet away, their breaths forming soft clouds in the cool night air. Owen spoke quietly, recounting memories from their time in the service, the missions, the nights under the stars, the bond that had kept them going through the darkest times. "I don't know how we got here," Owen said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I promise I'm not going anywhere, Rio. We'll figure this out together." As if understanding, Rio shifted closer, resting his head on his paws. His eyes, once so guarded, now held a glimmer of trust. It wasn't a full return to the dog Owen once knew, but it was a start. The following days brought more small victories. On a cloudy afternoon, Owen picked up the ball and tossed it gently across the yard. To his surprise, Rio hesitated only briefly before trotting after it. He didn't bring it back, but watching him hold the ball in his mouth was enough to make Owen laugh for the first time in weeks. "You're getting there, buddy," Owen said, clapping his hands softly. Rio dropped the ball and looked at him, his tail wagging faintly, barely a movement, but unmistakable. As night fell, Owen sat on the porch again, Rio lying beside him this time. They stared up at the stars, the silence between them no longer heavy but comforting. Owen reached down, his hand brushing against Rio's fur. "This isn't just about saving you," Owen murmured. "You're saving me too." For the first time, Rio didn't pull away. He stayed close, the warmth of his presence a reminder that healing wasn't about rushing, it was about showing up every day, with patience and love. Their journey wasn't over, but for the first time, Owen felt they were walking the same path again. The golden rays of the morning sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across Owen Carter's backyard. Rio followed at a steady distance as Owen prepared for the day ahead, his movements calm yet purposeful. Today, Owen had decided to recreate one of their old training routines from their time in service, an exercise that once symbolized their unbreakable bond. With a whistle around his neck and Rio's familiar rubber ball in hand, Owen hoped to reach the part of Rio that remembered who they used to be. "Let's take it slow, buddy," Owen said, his voice steady as he led Rio to the center of the yard. The German Shepherd's amber eyes tracked Owen's every move, his posture cautious but attentive. Owen raised the whistle to his lips and gave a soft, clear note, "Sit." For a long moment, Rio didn't move. His ears twitched, his body stiff as if weighing the command. Just when Owen began to wonder if he'd asked too much, Rio slowly lowered himself into a seated position. "Good boy," Owen exclaimed, his voice breaking with surprise and pride. Rio's gaze flicked up to him, his expression calm but no longer distant. Encouraged, Owen picked up the rubber ball and tossed it gently a few feet away. "Fetch, Rio," he called, his tone infused with the energy of the past. Rio hesitated. He watched the ball land, his ears swiveling as he seemed to assess the situation. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. Then, with a cautious step, Rio moved toward the ball. He sniffed it, nudging it lightly with his nose before finally picking it up in his mouth. Owen froze, watching as Rio turned and walked back toward him. When Rio reached Owen, he dropped the ball at his feet and looked up. It wasn't just a glance, it was a steady, searching gaze filled with something Owen hadn't seen in a long time: recognition. A spark of the old Rio, the partner who had once trusted him completely, had surfaced. "You did it, boy," Owen murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He crouched down, resting a hand lightly on Rio's head. The dog didn't pull away. For the first time, he leaned into Owen's touch, a quiet acknowledgement that the bond between them wasn't lost, It was being rebuilt, one step at a time. The rest of the day felt lighter. Rio followed Owen around the house, his presence no longer shadowed by hesitation. When Owen sat on the porch, Rio lay beside him, close enough for Owen to reach down and stroke his fur without any sign of discomfort. Later, as Owen cooked dinner, Rio rested near the kitchen, his eyes following Owen's every move. It was as if the walls Rio had built around himself were slowly crumbling. That evening, Owen sat on the couch, the rubber ball in his hands. Rio settled on the floor nearby, his head resting on his paws but his gaze fixed on Owen. "You remember, don't you?" Owen asked softly, spinning the ball between his fingers. "All those nights in the field, just you and me against the world." Rio didn't respond, but the faint wag of his tail said enough. Before bed, Owen left the bedroom door open, as he always did now. He lay awake for a while, listening to the quiet of the house. Then, just as his eyes began to close, he heard the soft sound of paws padding across the floor. He turned his head to see Rio standing at the threshold. For a moment, the dog hesitated, as if debating whether to come closer. Then, with deliberate steps, he crossed the room and lay down near the bed, his body relaxed, his eyes half closed. "Good night, Rio," Owen whispered, a smile tugging at his lips. He didn't need anything more. That small act of trust was everything. The days that followed were filled with more small victories. Each one, whether it was Rio accepting a treat from Owen's hand or following a simple command, was a reminder of the bond they were rebuilding. For Owen, these moments were more than just progress. They were a testament to resilience, to the power of trust and patience. Sitting on the porch one evening, Owen looked down at Rio, who now lay at his feet, his body at ease. "We're getting there, buddy," Owen said, running a hand through the German Shepherd's thick fur. "One step at a time." Rio lifted his head, his eyes meeting Owen's. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear, only trust. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the windows. Owen Carter sat cross-legged on the floor, his gaze fixed on Rio, who was resting a few feet away. The German Shepherd had been edging closer each day, his defenses lowering little by little. Tonight, Rio had taken a monumental step, bridging the physical gap with a hesitant touch of his nose to Owen's hand. It was brief, but the significance wasn't lost on Owen. He stayed still, letting the moment settle between them. "You're coming back to me, aren't you, Rio?" Owen whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He resisted the urge to reach out and touch the dog, knowing that trust was a fragile thing. Instead, he simply sat there, his heart brimming with quiet hope. As the rain intensified, the sound became a soothing backdrop to their shared silence. Rio eventually lay down on the rug, his breathing steady but his eyes still watchful. Owen leaned back, his own mind wandering to the past. He glanced over at the photo on the bedside table, a snapshot of him and Rio in the field, their bond unshakable even amidst chaos. That was the version of Rio Owen hoped to see again, though he knew it would take time. The next morning dawned clear, the storm having passed, leaving the world fresh and glistening. Owen decided to take advantage of the calm weather. "Let's go out, Rio," he said, grabbing the leash. The dog hesitated at the sight of it, but after a moment, he approached cautiously, allowing Owen to clip it onto his collar. They stepped outside into the cool morning air, the yard sparkling with leftover raindrops. This time, Owen didn't lead Rio through their usual route. Instead, he took him to the open field behind the house, a place where Rio could explore at his own pace. Owen carried the rubber ball, his fingers curling around it as if it were a lifeline. When they reached the middle of the field, he knelt down and placed the ball on the grass. "No pressure, buddy," he said softly. "It's here if you want it." Rio stood a few feet away, his posture tense but curious. He sniffed the air, his gaze flicking between Owen and the ball. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Rio stepped forward. Each movement was cautious, deliberate. When he reached the ball, he paused, nudging it lightly with his nose. Owen's breath hitched. "That's it," he murmured. "You remember." Rio picked up the ball with his mouth, his grip tentative at first, then firmer. He held it for a moment before dropping it at Owen's feet, his amber eyes meeting Owen's with a spark of something familiar. It wasn't quite the playful exuberance Owen remembered, but it was a start. "Good boy," Owen said, his voice breaking with pride. He tossed the ball a short distance, keeping his movements slow and measured. Rio hesitated but eventually trotted after it, bringing it back with slightly more confidence. They repeated the game a few more times, each throw a small victory, each return a step closer to the bond they'd once shared. Back at the house, Rio followed Owen inside, his tail wagging faintly, a motion Owen hadn't seen in months. It was a small but profound sign of progress. While Owen prepared a light lunch, Rio stayed close, lying in the kitchen doorway, as if ensuring he wouldn't be left behind. Later that evening, Owen found himself sitting on the porch steps, Rio at his side. The stars were just beginning to appear, dotting the deepening sky with pinpricks of light. Owen reached down, brushing his fingers lightly over Rio's fur. The dog didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into the touch, his body finally at ease. "You know, Rio," Owen said, his voice low, "I thought I was rescuing you. But maybe it's the other way around." Rio let out a soft huff, his head resting on Owen's knee as if to agree. In that moment, Owen realized something important. Healing wasn't a straight path. It was a series of small moments, fragile victories, and quiet connections that eventually built something whole. And with Rio by his side, he knew they'd find their way forward together. The night stretched on, but Owen didn't move. Neither did Rio. They stayed there, side by side, under the stars, two souls learning to trust again one small step at a time. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and fresh as the first rays of sunlight bathed the yard in a golden hue. Owen Carter stood on the porch, sipping his coffee and watching Rio roam across the damp grass. There was something different about the dog that morning. His movements were smoother, less hesitant. For fleeting moments, Rio seemed more like the confident partner Owen had known, rather than the traumatized shadow he had become. Determined to build on their progress, Owen picked up the old military whistle that had been a cornerstone of their training years ago. He held it in his hands, feeling the weight of its significance. Blowing two short whistles, the same familiar signal from their missions, he watched Rio closely. This time, Rio's reaction was immediate. His head snapped up, ears perked, his amber eyes locked on Owen. A flicker of recognition passed through his gaze, though it was layered with caution. Owen stayed still, his tone calm and encouraging. "Come on, Rio. You can do this," he murmured. Slowly, Rio took a few steps forward, his posture more confident than Owen had seen in months. The veteran's heart raced, but he maintained his composure, not wanting to overwhelm the dog. Reaching for the rubber ball beside him, Owen held it out for Rio to see. "Remember this?" he asked softly, tossing it a few feet away. For a moment, Rio froze, as though caught between instinct and memory. Then, with an unexpected burst of energy, he bounded toward the ball, picked it up in his mouth, and carried it back. Placing it at Owen's feet, Rio looked up at him with a spark in his eyes, something Owen hadn't seen in years. Owen's breath caught as tears welled in his eyes. "That's it, Rio. I knew you were still in there," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Picking up the ball, he threw it again, and this time Rio chased after it with more enthusiasm, his tail wagging faintly. It was a small gesture, but to Owen, it was monumental. Each return of the ball felt like a piece of their bond was being pieced back together. Later that day, as the sun set and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Owen sat on the worn couch in his living room. Rio lay beside him, his head resting near Owen's leg for the first time since arriving. Owen didn't speak or move much, choosing instead to let the quiet connection between them fill the room. He gently stroked Rio's fur, feeling the warmth of trust beginning to bloom again. "You've come a long way, partner," Owen said quietly, his fingers running through the dog's soft coat. "And we're not done yet, not by a long shot." Rio let out a contented sigh, his body fully relaxed for the first time since coming to Owen's home. The veteran leaned back, staring at the ceiling as he reflected on the journey they had taken together. It hadn't been easy. Each step forward had required patience, understanding, and love. But as he looked at Rio, Owen knew it had all been worth it. The night grew darker, and the house was still. For the first time in what felt like forever, Owen felt the heaviness in his chest begin to lift. It wasn't just about helping Rio heal. It was about finding healing together. They were two broken souls navigating their way back to wholeness. one small victory at a time. And as Owen turned off the light and drifted to sleep with Rio close by, he felt a quiet certainty settle over him. No matter how long the road ahead might be, they would face it together. They had already proven that they were a team, and nothing, not time, not trauma, not fear, could ever truly break that bond. The sun rose gently over the quiet town, casting a warm glow on Owen Carter's modest home. Inside, a quiet but monumental moment was unfolding. Rio stood in the center of the living room, his eyes focused on Owen, who held a leash in one hand and a faded military vest in the other. "Today's the day, Rio," Owen said softly, a hopeful smile on his face. It had been weeks of small steps, of patience, and of slowly rebuilding the bridge between them. Now, Owen had decided to take Rio to the park where they had spent so many carefree moments before their lives were forever changed. It was a symbolic gesture, a way to honor their past and embrace the future. As they drove to the park, Rio sat in the back seat of Owen's truck, his head slightly leaning out the open window. The breeze ruffled his fur, and for the first time in months, his posture seemed relaxed. Owen glanced at him through the rearview mirror, feeling a swell of pride and relief. "Just like the old times, huh, buddy?" Owen murmured, though he didn't expect an answer. When they arrived, the park was quiet, bathed in the soft light of mid-morning. Owen attached Rio's leash and stepped onto the grassy field. The German Shepherd hesitated for a moment, scanning the open space. Then, with a small nod of encouragement from Owen, Rio took a confident step forward, his tail wagging faintly. Owen pulled out the rubber ball, a relic of their past missions and moments of play. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it across the field. Rio stood still for a heartbeat, as if processing the movement, and then bolted after it. The sight of Rio bounding through the grass, his body moving with purpose and joy, brought a lump to Owen's throat. For hours, they played together, the barriers of trauma and time seemingly erased. Rio fetched the ball repeatedly, his tail wagging faster each time he returned it to Owen. The trust between them had grown, and the connection they once shared felt almost tangible again. As the sun began to set, Rio rested his head on Owen's leg, his body relaxed and his breathing steady. Owen stroked the dog's fur, his own heart lighter than it had been in years. "I told you I wouldn't give up on you, Rio," he whispered. The German Shepherd's ears twitched, and for a moment, he tilted his head to meet Owen's gaze. It wasn't just a look, it was an acknowledgement. They had come so far from the brokenness of those early days. Though neither of them would ever be the same as before, they had built something new, something stronger. On the drive home, the truck was quiet except for the sound of Rio's steady breathing. Owen felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Rio wasn't just a dog. He was a symbol of survival, of resilience, and of the unbreakable bond that had carried them through the darkest times. As they pulled into the driveway, Owen parked the truck and opened the door for Rio, who stepped down with confidence, his tail wagging lightly. That night, as Owen sat on the couch, Rio curled up beside him, resting his head against Owen's leg. It was the closest they'd been since Rio had come home, and Owen didn't move, letting the moment linger. For the first time in a long while, Owen felt whole. The road ahead might still have challenges, but he knew one thing for certain: he and Rio would face it together, side by side. The bond they shared had been tested, but it had emerged stronger, a testament to the healing power of patience, love, and unwavering loyalty. The story of Owen Carter and Rio serves as a profound reminder of the power of patience, love, and perseverance in the face of life's challenges. Their journey reflects the struggles we all face, grappling with pain, loss, and the uncertainty of rebuilding something we hold dear. Just as Owen refused to give up on Rio, even when progress seemed painfully slow, we too must learn to extend patience and understanding in our relationships and to ourselves. Healing, whether emotional or physical, rarely happens overnight. It's a process of small, consistent steps that often feel insignificant in the moment, but build toward meaningful transformation. Owen's commitment to Rio shows that true connection comes from showing up, even when it's difficult, and creating an environment of safety and trust. In our lives, we can apply this by fostering empathy in our relationships, listening without judgment, giving space when needed, and offering support without demanding immediate result. It's a reminder that the bonds we build, whether with loved ones, friends, or even ourselves, require dedication and vulnerability. Furthermore, Owen's story underscores the importance of resilience. Life will test us, and we will encounter setbacks that feel insurmountable. But like Owen, who found joy in the smallest signs of progress, we must celebrate the little victories that mark our path forward. Whether it's taking the first step toward mending a broken relationship, achieving a small personal goal, or simply finding the strength to keep going, these moments matter. Lastly, Owen and Rio's journey highlights the significance of companionship. Just as Rio's presence helped Owen confront his own wounds, the connections we cultivate can be transformative. In today's fast-paced, often disconnected world, prioritizing meaningful relationships can bring the grounding and healing we need. The advice we can draw is simple yet profound. Be patient, both with yourself and others. Trust the process of growth, no matter how slow it feels. Find strength in connection and never underestimate the power of showing up for those who matter, even when it's hard. Most importantly, believe in the possibility of rebuilding, because the most fulfilling relationships and personal growth often come from the hardest-earned victories. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on the incredible power of resilience and love. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more inspiring stories like this one.